Hi, Alex. It's great to have you back.
Good to be back. Good to see you.
Yeah. So I'm going to tell everybody a little bit about you. That right now I'm talking to Alex, who is a geologist from Illinois, and you are interested in Jordan Peterson because you want to find a creative way to confront chaos.
I would say
And
that's right.
I remember you telling me that you were building an application to provide the opportunity for direct experiential knowledge of beauty through emergent symbols. And since I'm also very interested in symbol, that really caught my eye. So, are you still working on that?
I am. I'm making progress on it, and I'm happy with the progress. Um, but essentially, I'm trying to build something that will allow people to interface with um a high degree of complexity.
I lost your visual, Alex. There you go. Okay.
Okay, sorry. Um, yeah, to just basically allow people to interface with visual chaos or visual randomness, and um, through a certain process allow them to see order emerging from that, and just in a very aesthetically pleasing way, so that it sort of I don't know if I would say acclimatizes you to dealing with anomaly, dealing with chaos, but because it's not something, I don't want to say acclimatizing, because it's not exactly desensitizing or anything like that. It's more like becoming more comfortable with uncertainty, and like Peterson says, approaching chaos voluntarily.
Well, it sounds a little bit like what you're trying to do is help people to um, be able to pay attention long enough to find the spot where the meaning lies in the midst of the chaos.
Yeah, that's true.
That's a lot like what I do with some of my paintings, where I create a lot
Mhm.
of chaos and then I have to look at it for a while. What's in there?
Yeah, you kind of have to contemplate the image for a while to see things emerge, but they will emerge.
Hmm. Well, so the reason that we're getting together today is sort of all things Jordan Peterson, because I had this idea that it would be really interesting to look at the conclusion of Maps of Meaning.
Hmm.
And Maps of Meaning was published in 1999, but Jordan Peterson wrote that book over the course of 15 years. And really, it's a cascade of psychology, history, mythology, evolutionary theory. Almost every pursuit of knowledge is bundled up in there. And the text is dense and it's complicated and it's layered, sort of like going through an archaeological dig. Um, so Peterson uses several frames to discuss his ideas. One of those frames is anomaly, and that by that he sort of means that which interrupts the normal flow of events. And another frame is what he calls interest or divine interest, and sort of that's the glimmer that calls us forward. And if we choose voluntarily to follow our interests, then we can develop our uniqueness. But if we deny our interests for the sake of fitting in, then we never do develop our personalities. He calls that the lie. That's the living in denial, right? So
Hmm.
finally, he uses the frame of value, or the binary of good and evil, which he also calls polarity. And so the whole last section in what he calls the conclusion looks at those three things. Anomaly is a big section of the book. Probably a third of the book is about anomaly. And so you and I are going to do several sessions on this. And I thought it would be good to start by reading a letter that Jordan Peterson wrote to his father when he began writing this book. And then after we kind of go through what the letter might bring up for us, then we'll take a look at the last 15 pages of the book, some of the pertinent sections, and see what we can make of it. How does that sound?
Sounds really interesting.
Okay.
I'm game.
Okay. So I like to read, so if you don't mind, I'll read a paragraph and then we'll talk about it.
Now, please do.
Okay, here we go. November 1986. Dear Dad, I promised you that one day I would tell you what the book I am trying to write is supposed to be about. I haven't been working on it much in the last month, although in some regards it is always on my mind, and everything I learn in my other work has some bearing upon it. Because I have abandoned it temporarily, I thought perhaps I could tell you about it, and that would help me organize my thoughts. I don't completely understand the driving force behind what I have been working on, although I understand it better now than I used to 3 or 4 years ago, when it was literally driving me crazy. I had been obsessed with the idea of war for 3 or 4 years prior to that, often dreaming extremely violent dreams centered around the theme of destruction. I believe now that my concern with death on a mass scale was intimately tied into my personal life, and that concerns with the meaning of life on a personal level, which arise with the contemplation of death, took a general form for me which had to do with the value of humanity and the purpose of life in general.
Hmm.
What
Yeah,
do you
it sounds
think
like
when you hear that?
it's obvious that he was, and it's so great that he shares this letter with the reader to give you some insight into what he's going through in his personal life in a general way.
Mm-hmm.
But he's obviously in the midst of a, I guess you could call it an existential crisis, uh, or has been, and
I
yeah.
was trying to think of the time frame of what
Mm,
age that would put him at. So 1986 is 34 years ago. So he would have been in his early to mid 20s,
mm,
which would be about the age. I had a lot of early to mid 20 young people today are not thinking that deeply. But then there are others who are. I mean, obviously, the concern with war and death and tragedy is maybe even as large right now for some as it was for him then.
mm-hmm.
What was happening historically in 19? He said it started destroying him 3 or 4 years previous, would have been like 1982. So
Mm-hmm.
that would have been early in the United States. That would have been early in Reagan's first term.
Right.
And the U.S. had come through some very, very difficult years in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And we were still on the verge, I guess we were still on the verge of nuclear destruction because that would be pre-Gorbachev.
Right.
So there was still all this buildup of nuclear armaments. And
Mm-hmm. The wall was still standing.
yeah, that's
At
true.
that time. Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of history that took place even while he was, before he began the book and while he was writing the book.
Right. Well, something struck him that doesn't strike, or it struck him in a way that it doesn't strike everybody. Um, that caused him that caused this to really be of utmost importance and interest to
Yeah,
him.
yeah. And so I guess that's another point, that this whole idea of interest being so key to developing ourselves personally. He had
Mm,
this interest and he followed it, even though it took him into really scary places.
right.
The other thing I found interesting is that he wrote this letter to his father and what that says about the kind of relationship he had with
Yeah.
his father.
Yeah, that is interesting. I That struck me too. Just to uh, it made me kind of think about. Well, it made me wonder how his dad thought about that letter. You know, what he thought about Jordan at that time. If he was concerned for him,
Hmm.
um, or if he was more more proud, or that he was trying to tackle such a large topic, and um, or if he really understood. Jordan was trying to get at.
That's a really good point. I kind of think maybe if my 25-year-old wrote me a letter like that, I would think, oh my gosh, what is she on right now? What is she thinking about? You know, it's kind of
Yeah,
scary.
right.
Um,
Without the
a
context.
really scary place, or
Yeah, yeah,
and maybe there's some megalomania there or something. Like, how could he imagine that he's found a problem that nobody else has found, or that he's found a solution that nobody else has found? And as a
hmm
parent, you would kind of wonder, but he seemed to have had complete confidence in his father, and so his father must be a
yeah,
remarkable person.
yeah, yeah. It certainly seems that he felt comfortable sharing that with his dad in the letter, and it didn't seem like it was that had been the first time that he'd ever spoke candidly and about such deep and intense topics to his dad. That
Yeah, yeah.
didn't seem that way.
Well, let's carry on here.
Mm-hmm.
Carl Jung has suggested that all personal problems are relevant to society because we are all so much alike, and that any sufficiently profound solution to a personal problem may, if communicated, reduce the likelihood of that problem existing in anyone's experience in the future. This is, in fact, how society and the individual support one another.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that really jumped out at me because when I first started listening to Jordan Peterson a couple of years ago, and I heard one of the biblical lectures, he made a statement somewhat similar to that. And all of a sudden, I remembered back to probably about the same time, maybe 1999, or, well, except that he's writing this letter 15 years before he wrote the book. But yeah,
Yeah.
right around the year 2000, I was, for a number of reasons, I was a new mom. I had a little toddler running around. When you have toddlers, you don't use very many words, and most of the words you use are 3 and 4 letter words. And
Yeah.
so I had kind of lost my ability to articulate deep ideas, and I was a deep thinker, and that really bothered me.
Mm.
And so I started doing art, and art was sort of a way to express myself. And as I was doing that, I started thinking, wow, each of us is this amalgam of unique history, unique experience.
Mm.
The books I've read are different than the books you've read. The songs I've heard are different than the songs you've heard. The people I've met are completely different than the people you've met. And so
Mm-hmm.
the way that the matrix of my personality and my brain and my mind are formed is completely unique to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I see the world through a completely unique filter
Mm.
from anyone else, but every single person has a unique filter like that.
Yeah.
And, and I started thinking, well, that's kind of like an experiential DNA,
Mm-hmm.
and it's built
Mm.
into each person. But our physical DNA we pass on through our children and grandchildren, and that's what forms the future. And so it's essential that we also pass on this experiential DNA, because if we don't, then society is actually losing out. So I began to
Right.
teach classes in creativity where I was challenging people. You have to speak creatively into the
Mm.
world. It doesn't have to be through painting or art
Yeah.
or music, but if it's cooking, or if it's sewing, or if it's building, or if it's woodworking, or whatever
Mm.
way that you can express, because there are certain things in our experiential DNA that cannot be expressed in words, and they have
Right.
to be communicated to other people at that deeper level.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of think that's what you're working on as well, right?
It is. Yeah. I think I recognize that what you're saying. I recognize that in myself, and it seems like it's not just personal to me.
Mm-hmm.
Hearing you talk about your experience tells me that it's not just personal to me, that you have had that experience, and I look around and I see that it's it's universal. It seems to be universal that we all have the need to express our experience, and whether that be verbally or non-verbally, and we all have I think the most exposure we have is to verbally and written,
Mm-hmm.
but there's so many other ways, as you say, and that's unique, particular to every individual.
Well, and
Mhm.
it seems to me that, and maybe it's because I'm kind of officious by nature, but it seems to me that it's almost an obligation to speak this into the world, because
Yeah.
at least from my perspective of life, we have received all of those things, are received
Mhm.
knowledge at a very deep level. And
Yeah.
so they're like gifts. They're like little
Yeah.
treasures that we have received. Or even the suffering that we have gone through in life
Mhm.
is in some sense a gift, because it has deepened our wellspring, it has deepened our capacity for love, it has deepened our capacity for experience. So all of those things that we have received that make us who we are,
Mhm.
when we communicate them back into the world, we make the future a richer place for everybody.
I agree. And even if it isn't something that is a well-formed, complete sentence or paragraph of an idea, or the artistic or visual equivalent of that, it still has value, because it's kind of like fodder
Mm-hmm.
for other people's creativity and other people's I mean, if we didn't have the fragments of information and creativity from everyone else that we've ever been exposed to, directly or indirectly through history, we wouldn't have anything to work with. We wouldn't be able to form any ideas or thoughts. We wouldn't be able to think or be creative. So it's all about perpetuating that gift
Mm-hmm.
of just expression, essentially. Um,
Yeah, and that makes me think of what Jordan Peterson talks about quite often when he talks about um,
Mark, can you take a call
sorry.
on part one, please?
when Jordan Peterson talks about at every moment, there's an infinite field of possibility in front of us. And we have no way of choosing. We have no, unless we have a frame or some ultimate goal, there's
Yeah.
too many choices in front of us. But whatever choice that we make, each choice, each moment is actually, that's how we move into the future. So we're sort of constructing our future in front of us based on the choices that we make. So if I make a bad choice, I'm creating a little bit of a bad future for myself. Or if rather than trying for delayed gratification, if I go for instant gratification, then I get a little blip in my future, which is rather pleasant, but then down the road, it makes a bad future for me. But if I delay gratification, I get a little downward blip because I'm not getting what I want, but down the road, that becomes a better future. So all
Yeah.
these choices are essential for building the future in front of us.
Right. Well, that's such a deep area of a deep topic right there. The difference between what we do out of seeking instant gratification or seeking to satisfy desire, versus what we do that has a higher meaning, or a deeper meaning that's worth sacrificing the present for the future.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you get to a place where you recognize the difference and can really be connected to that in a not just an intellectual way, beyond the words, really feel that and understand that. I think that's at the core.
Yeah. Yeah.
of a lot of what Jordan is getting at.
Well, just now when you said understand, it made me think about yesterday I was rewatching the original discussion that Paul Vanderklay had with Jordan Peterson.
Mm.
He had an opportunity to have Jordan Peterson on his channel once, maybe a year and a half ago. I'll put a link to it on here so people can watch it. It's about
Mhm.
a half an hour long, and they're talking about what it means to understand truth, and that to understand that it's impossible to understand something unless you have acted upon it. It must
Hmm.
be acted out in order to
Yeah.
truly be understood.
Yeah.
So people tend to think, well, I have mental assent, I understand it intellectually, I understand it. But
Yeah.
but actually, until you act upon it, you don't understand it.
Yeah. And I would say, or it's acted upon you.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's scary. That's true. That's really true. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, that's either way. Its action is what makes it real somehow.
Yep. Well, I'm just going to finish up this paragraph. So I stopped right in the middle of the paragraph there. The last sentence was, this is in fact how society and the individual support one another. It was in this way that my concern with war, which is the application of death on the general level, led me into concepts and ideas concerning the meaning of life on the personal level, which I could never have imagined as relevant or believable prior to learning about them, and which I still believe border on what might normally be considered insanity.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess it's not too far afield to think that even he was wondering about his experience. Maybe that's one of the reasons he was sharing with his dad, because he talks about all the time about how we outsource our sanity by bouncing ideas off of each other and making sure we haven't gone too far afield.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Alex, I think we should do like half-hour segments on this. So I'm going to pause right here, and we'll call this segment the segment that was about, let's say, experiential DNA and coming to an understanding of what creates deep meaning in life. And then we'll pick up and move on from there with the next section of the letter. How does that sound?
All right. That sounds great.
Okay. So for anybody who's interested in this and who likes the information on this channel, it would be greatly helpful if you would subscribe. And also if you would just click that you like, or if you don't like it, click that you don't like it. But I would prefer that you click that you like it. And always, always comment, because I love reading the comment threads. They are really terrific.